right. Well, welcome to another podcast episode here at The Wealthy Ironworker. And today's podcast is a passionate one, and one that I, for certain, thought that was pretty widespread as far as the knowledge. You know, the things that I'm going to talk about in this podcast episode, I believed was pretty commonplace. However, with a conversation with a former ironworker, I realized that it's not. And so in the spirit of providing just one more place that somebody can find the information and that they can at least hear about it in a podcast episode, we will be talking about personal protective equipment, or as it's more commonly called, PPE. Now, if anybody listens to this podcast episode and wants to use it in their training from an OSHA perspective, I do not care. You have full permission to do so. That's great. We could do nothing better than to spread the word far and wide about what it is, its limitations, etc., going forward. Now, that conversation that I mentioned earlier, I talked to a former ironworker that was telling me about 2 weeks ago approximately that he had been working for a contractor, and he initially reached out to me because of my years of experience in the safety field and asked me what requirements are there from a lead testing and protection for workers in a lead environment. I told him, of course, that companies are supposed to assess the hazards on a job site, and that if they know lead to be there, they have to mitigate that and take care of that problem. Which then I followed up that with a text message to him with the lead standard, or a link online where he could quickly go. After numerous years of being in this field and doing all of these safety-related topics and whatnot, we're taking steps in the right direction with having the OSHA website, which you can easily navigate. But I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that some people are willing / interested to reach out to other people, and going forward, at least listen to a podcast episode where it's easiest for them to just either hit the play button or just ask somebody and send a text message. Perfectly fine with me. Whatever gets the information out there. The reason he had been reaching out to me primarily was because his memory was starting to go. This is somebody who is in their 30s. He was having trouble with his memory, and he was beginning to notice that he was slurring his words. These are both symptoms of lead poisoning. To which I quickly said, you need to go get your blood tested, checked out, so that you can ascertain whether it is lead poisoning or not. But our conversation continued, which he told me then that there were workers that were at his company working that were welding without the proper PPE. And indeed, they didn't even have safety glasses or gloves. And if you wanted to wear them or use them, that the company would deduct it from your paycheck. In other words, they were making workers pay for their PPE. This conversation right there was the catalyst for me to go full stop, a podcast episode detailing PPE and talking all about it is necessary. That's why we're talking about it in this podcast episode. For the remainder of this podcast episode, we will be talking about numerous things. I want to talk about hazard control, because PPE is, as we say, the last level of control. In the case of the lead poisoning, for example, a more appropriate response to that lead would be to remove it off of the job site or where you're going to be welding. It will be far safer for the worker if the lead is removed when it can be removed than to have some kind of PPE like a respirator in this case, because it is the last line of defense. So we're going to talk about the hierarchy of controls. We'll also talk about what items of PPE that I'm specifically going to talk about. The fact that the company, not the employee, but the company is required to pay for that PPE. What requirements employees have. And lastly, which of the items are we specifically going to be talking about? Now, in this case, I'll just go ahead and give you a heads up. I will primarily be talking about it from a building trades perspective. That means iron workers, pipe fitters, electricians, etc. These are the individuals that reside in the building trade space that I am currently thinking about. There could be other articles of PPE that I may or may not touch on that you might have questions. If that's the case, feel free to drop me a line, whether it's in the comments or also on the contact page of the website, thewealthyironworker.com, because I want to make sure that you get to talk to the right person to make sure that you are adequately protecting yourself. You have only one life. Let's live it to the best that we can. All right. Kicking off this podcast episode then, aside from what we just talked about, is going to be the hierarchical controls. Number one, for those of you who may not know, the first thing from a control perspective is what we call an engineering control. In other words, if we can engineer something, if we can make a change in the design or the way things work, then what we can do then is we can effectively say, this is an engineering control. I'll give you an example. If we can substitute a less harmful material, lead paint, to go along with the example that I used earlier, lead paint is a superior paint. It does great. It holds up against a lot of different things. The major problem with lead paint, of course, is that it's extremely toxic to human beings. So over the course of the decades, we have phased lead paint out to substitute it in with newer, far more safer types of paint. That's an example of an engineering control. Now, that has taken place over decades of time. But we don't just get rid of lead paint altogether. It's all over the place. If you're driving on old bridges, if you're working in old industrial facilities or manufacturing facilities or whatever, there is still a lot of lead paint there. Typically, the standard or rule of thumb is, if it's prior to 1970 or whatever, what have you, it's statistically likely that you're dealing with something that has been painted with lead. Even if there's newer paint over top of it, the likelihood is that you could have lead underneath it. Another example of a quote-unquote engineering control is asbestos. Asbestos, of course, causes cancer, and it is detrimental to the human body. So we've begun to phase that out. That does not mean that asbestos is not out there in the world today. It certainly is. In my old house, underneath the vinyl siding, asbestos tiles are on the outside. Asbestos was a good insulator. It's just very toxic to the human body. And so lead and asbestos are but two examples of an engineering control. This is the top quality. If we can do this, this is what we want to do. But if we can't, or we're encountering a situation at work when an engineering control either doesn't work or is non-applicable, then we institute the next level, which is a work practice control. Now, a work practice control is something that we put into place, or practice, if you will, at work. A classic example would be heat. There are facilities or places of work in this country today that the heat alone can cause significant problems with people. So we rotate people in and out. You might work for 10 minutes in this enormous heat. step out, somebody else takes your place so that you have time to cool off, and they go in and they work in this hot environment. That's an example of a work practice control. Same thing with something that is, there's noise. Noise can incorporate a work practice control. And even at a nuclear facility where somebody might be exposed if they stay in an area too long and they rotate people out, that's another example of a work practice control. Now, obviously, if we can engineer it out, that's better. Work practice then is the next step. But in the case that engineering controls we cannot do or are non-applicable, and then we are unable to execute work practice controls, then we fall to what is normally called the last line of defense, and that is PPE, personal protective equipment. The subject of this podcast today. PPE is the last line of defense. Those of us that reside in the safety realm intuitively know this to be true. In other words, I put on a pair of safety glasses and I'm grinding. There is nothing between the spark, or the operation, whatever it happens to be, between that operation and my eye, except for the PPE. In this case, the safety glasses. Ergo, the last line of defense. The same thing holds true when it comes to gloves, when it comes to hearing noise, and many of the other PPE or personal protective equipment articles that you think about on a job site. PPE is the last line of defense. Far too often, companies will hunker down and with every single hazard that they're going to encounter will tell you to wear PPE. And when in fact, there are other things that we could do aside from PPE to greater protect the workers. But this podcast episode here is not for employers. It's for employees. It still goes to, we still should note that the PPE is the last line of defense. If there is something else that we could do, could we put handrail up around an opening to prevent you from getting closer to an unprotected edge? Well, if we can do that, then that's preferable over having to make someone wear a harness all the time. But PPE is the last line of defense. All right. So now transitioning from the hierarchical controls to which PPE that I am talking about. The PPE, and I have the handout. This is directly from OSHA. It has been developed, and it is usually the handout that accompanies a OSHA 10-hour presentation. So this isn't just coming from me. Even though I've done numerous OSHA 10-hour courses, this is taken directly from that handout there. Quote, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration requires that employers protect you from workplace hazards that can cause injury or illness. Controlling a hazard at its source is the best way to protect workers. However, when engineering, work practice, and administrative controls, which we just talked about, are not feasible or do not provide sufficient protection, employers must provide personal protective equipment to you and ensure its use. PPE is equipment worn to minimize exposure to a variety of hazards. Examples include items such as gloves, foot and eye protection, protective hearing protection, earplugs, muffs, etc., hard hats, and respirators, end quote. And there it is. They even mentioned the engineering controls that I discussed along with the work practice controls. PPE is indeed the last line of defense. And now we skip down one section on this handout to read this. Quote, employers must pay for personal protective equipment. PPE in parentheses. Quote, on May 15th, 2008, a new OSHA rule about employer payment for PPE went into effect. With few exceptions, which we will discuss, OSHA now requires employers to pay for personal protective equipment used to comply with OSHA standards. The final rule does not create new requirements regarding what PPE employers must provide. The standard makes clear that employers cannot require workers to provide their own PPE, and the workers' use of PPE they already own must be completely voluntary. Even when a worker provides his or her own PPE, the employer must ensure that the equipment is adequate to protect the worker from hazards at the workplace. End quote. Now that is worth rereading because I want to make sure this is crystal clear. The existence of this podcast episode is primarily due to people that are entering into the workforce today and don't know about this. This podcast is here. I implore that you share it out to other people, as many people as possible, because you just might reach somebody who does not know that they are not required to buy the PPE. The employer is, to keep you safe. So let me read this again. Quote, the standard makes clear that employers cannot require workers to provide their own PPE, and the workers' use of PPE they already own must be completely voluntary. Meaning if you already own a piece of PPE, you might have a hard hat, for example. If you want to use it at your place of employment, that you can, but your employer cannot make you. They have to provide that for you. And continues, even when a worker provides his or her own PPE, the employer must ensure that the equipment is adequate to protect the worker from hazards at the workplace. In other words, when an employer says you have a hard hat, you can use it and bring it in, they're accepting responsibility. They are effectively saying, I've inspected that hard hat. It'll protect you from the hazards. Therefore, I'm basically signing on the dotted line for liability. For those of you who might be listening to me today, your employer is bound by law to provide you with PPE, and they are bound to also pay for it. Not you. Not a deduction out of your check. They are required to pay for it. Well, this is a good segue into the examples of the PPE that employers must pay for. First on the list, again, directly from OSHA's handout that we do when we deliver an introduction to OSHA PowerPoint or lesson. Number one, metatarsal foot protection. This is just like a steel toe, except it has an additional protection protecting the top of the foot. Either a composite or a steel cover, so that if something is dropped on the top of your foot and not just a toe, it is protected. That is something that an employer, if you are required when they go to a job site and you need metatarsal foot protection, that the employer is responsible to pay for that. Rubber boots with steel toes. If for one reason or the other you are on a job or your employer is requiring that you have rubber steel toe shoes, then they are required to pay for that. Non-prescription eye protection or safety glasses that are not prescription. They may be dark safety glasses if your employer is outside, or they may be clear safety glasses. It's not as important when it comes to the darks or the clears. What's important is that the company is actually providing you with PPE to protect your eyes for what you're doing. That's the actual thing that you need to be concerned with. All right? But they have to provide safety glasses of some sort. It's part of your PPE, and the company has to pay for it. Goggles and face shields. If you are grinding, if you're having to grind with a grinder on the job, and those of you who might be listening know what I'm talking about. If you're not, you can very easily grind, but It has an abrasive disc on the end, and it's grinding usually something metal. It's throwing off a lot of sparks. It's usually throwing off some metal too. That face shield that you're required to wear, that is not meant for impact, but meant for diverting those sparks or any kind of foreign matter, they are required to pay for the face shield. Next up, and for the purposes of what we're doing, I'm only going to focus on these next three. Hard hats. I have one right here. Again, it's not so much the type of hard hat, whether it's a stylish one like this or one that you can get that costs, this one here probably costs about $100 plus. If the employer is paying for it, they may opt to buy one of the more plastic looking hard hats that are a fraction of the cost. Nonetheless, if you are required to wear a hard hat, it is not on you to provide for that particular piece of PPE. It is for the employer to pay for that particular piece of PPE. Now, it may not be what you want. Same thing with the safety glasses. You may want darks outside and clears inside, and they may just give you clears all the way around. They are providing you with PPE. It may not be what you want. Nonetheless, they are required to pay for said PPE when the hazards are there. Hearing protection. I cannot tell you how many young people that I encounter and have encountered throughout my entire career who believe that they're indestructible and they don't need any kind of hearing protection. Worse off still are the ones that think I'm going to put my headphones in and that's going to suffice for my hearing protection. All you are effectively doing at that particular point, and you might even have an employer that suggests this, but all you're really doing at that particular point is substituting one noise-making endeavor, grinding or whatever, for another. If I can hear those headphones and I'm standing away from you, then it's too loud. And it's not hearing protection. It's just another way to make noise. Ear plugs or ear muffs, these would not be ear muffs, by the way, are the proper PPE that you should be using out in the field. And again, the employer is supposed to pay for it. And last but not least, we're going to talk about gloves. Again, this is one of those items that there are a multitude of gloves out there. What's important is that you line up the specific glove to the hazard that it is protecting you from. And in the spirit of what we got going on here, your gloves might look like these leather gloves here. Or they might look like these. They may also look like these from a welding perspective. Or these. And for a more dexterity approach, like TIG gloves, maybe like this. There are others. None of these that I just showed are Kevlar, that are cut resistant, that you may find that your employer is on a job site or at a facility or somewhere like that. It requires the use of Kevlar gloves. There are other types of gloves, could be rubber, and that's a whole different ball game there. Nonetheless, what you need to know is that A, the glove has to protect you from the hazard, and that B, your employer is required to pay for that specific PPE article. Now, that's what the employer has to pay for. Let's get into what the employer does not have to pay for. Because and the reason why is because there's been some confusion in the past, and OSHA has specifically articulated this. Again, directly from their handout. Non-specialty safety toe shoes, so just regular work boots. Your employer is not required to pay for that. That's on you. If I had one thing to say to you, is that you're going to spend hours upon hours on your feet. invest in a good pair of work boots. There's my plug. Your everyday clothing, long sleeve shirt, stuff for like winter, that kind of stuff that you can wear back and forth. That's also on you. I'll line item these next 2 points. I'll read them directly, how they have them said. Items such as hair nets and gloves worn by food workers for consumer safety, which does not really fit into the building trades, which is where my mind goes when I'm talking about this PPE. And lifting belts, because their value in protecting the back is questionable. Again, not something that I would think of when I'm thinking about PPE out in the workforce. And this last one is a super important point that I want to make sure you understand. When the employee has lost or intentionally damaged the PPE and it must be replaced. Let me read that again, because that's how important this is. When the employee has lost or intentionally damaged the PPE and it must be replaced. In other words, if you work for a company that says, I'm giving you this pair of gloves, when it's worn out, bring it back to me and I'll give you a new pair. I want to institute a level of personal responsibility on your part. If you have lost it or intentionally damaged it because you don't like it, again, they may provide you with some safety glasses that are very uncomfortable and that you don't particularly like. You don't like the way that you look with them on, whatever. If you intentionally damage them or when you have lost them, then they're not required to pay for that next set of PPE. That's on you. And the intent right here, obviously, is to hold the employee, i.e. you, accountable. And this should make sense. In other words, if you have an employer that provides you with the PPE, they buy it, they have a program, they give it out, there's a level of personal responsibility on your end to properly maintain that PPE, to use it to the full advantage, but then turn around and make sure that you take good care of it, which is the next segue into the last point. We're going to talk about employer responsibilities or obligations and employee responsibilities or obligations. First up, your employer is supposed to assess all the hazards to provide you with the right PPE to address the right hazards. In other words, I don't want to give you a pair of rubber gloves for welding operations. That doesn't make sense. They don't protect your hand. As a matter of fact, they actually endanger it, right? Because the rubber will obviously melt. So the employer then has the responsibility and obligation to do what they call hazard assessment, to assess what's going on the job site and then to provide you with the right PPE to protect you from the hazard. They are also obligated to train you on the proper use of it. Those of us who have been in the field for a long time take for granted that everybody knows how to wear PPE properly. That's not the case. Perhaps the best example that I can clearly come up with is most people do not wear earplugs correctly. You are supposed to wear them where they feel very uncomfortable in your ear because they go in deeper to actually protect your ear. Most people don't wear them correctly when I encounter them, which means then no one has taken the time to show them. Your employer is responsible to train you on not just how to use it, but also to its limitations. There are limitations to PPE. Indeed, it is not just the last line of defense to protect you, but there are also limitations to PPE, to specific articles of PPE. A face shield, for example, is not meant for an impact. It's meant to deflect. That's why you are supposed to have a pair of safety glasses on underneath the face shield, because the face shield is not meant for full-on impact. They are also obligated to maintain and replace worn-out PPE. Again, if you take personal responsibility and turn in old or worn-out PPE, then they are obligated to provide you with new PPE to substitute that which has been worn out. And lastly, they're also obligated to maintain that PPE program and then evaluate it. If hazards change, if they're on a completely different job site with new hazards, new PPE might be necessary that they did not have before. In the case of, at the beginning of this podcast episode, a new hazard might very well be we have to mitigate for lead that we haven't had to before. So now we're going to institute a respiratory training program where you have to wear a respirator just to be extra cautious and make sure that you don't receive lead poisoning. You want to talk about a specific and significant decrease in human quality of life? Lead poisoning is definitely one of them. Now we're going to transition into the very last piece, which is what you're responsible for as an employee. You are responsible to properly wear the PPE. You may work outside all day long and you may want to have a pair of dark glasses because it's hot and bright. But if your employer provides you with a pair of clear safety glasses, and they only provide you with a pair of clear safety glasses, then that's what you are to wear. Sunglasses that you buy off the shelf at a store do not offer you the same level of protection and therefore should not be worn. The same can be said for the hard hat. They may not provide you with the hard hat that you would like to wear, whatever it happens to be. But if they have provided you with a hard hat and trained you on how to wear it, then that's what you are to do. You have the obligation and the responsibility, when they have provided it, to wear it properly. You also have the responsibility to attend any training that they might put on so that you know how to use it in accordance with not just the manufacturer who makes it, but the company policy. And you also have the responsibility to care for it, to keep it safe. You don't intentionally damage your PPE to try to get new or try to get better. You have to take care of the PPE. So in short, employers have the responsibility to purchase PPE and to provide it to you. But you also have the responsibility to wear it and care for it correctly so that you may maximize its life usage. And I'll end the podcast episode on this. You only have one life to live. You have one set of eyes, one set of ears, one set of hands and fingers. And it's likely that you have family members who would like for you to come home the same way you went to work, completely intact. For those of you who are young, PPE is the last line of defense and you are not indestructible. In many ways, you are even more exposed because you think that you're often indestructible. Your hearing matters. Your eyesight matters. Wearing hard hats matter. When your employer provides them, wear it. And if your employer does not provide them, let somebody know. You can join the conversation at thewealthyironworker.com, or you can respond to this podcast episode in the comments on the YouTube page, or let me know and send me an email. I'll get you connected to who you need to get connected with to solve this problem. It's a problem that definitely needs to be solved. Employers have been responsible for providing PPE since 2008, and there are still companies out there today who break the law. This podcast episode here is yet one more attempt to educate others. And if you're listening and you know other people that could benefit from it, please share it out. This has been all about PPE. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you on the next podcast episode.